Okay. Good morning to everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Daryl, for the introduction. Good morning, Professor Carl Poblador, to the other speakers in this forum, to students of AIMS, and as well as those in the maritime sector. So what I wanted to talk about today is on an anthropological examination on the roots of Filipino maritime culture and identity. So, okay, we all know that the Philippines is an archipelago. So we are made up of more than 7,500 islands. So the country is bounded by oceans and seas. And of course, within each island, there would be several rivers flowing into the seas. Because of this presence of several islands, different cultures emerged in different parts of the archipelago. According to Dr. Robert Fox, former director of the National Museum, he says that there are at least 106 ethnic groups in the country. And according to the Summer Institute of Linguistics, there are more than 180 languages in the country. And we have diverse religious traditions as well, such as Christianity, Islam, and indigenous Philippine religions. So uh, we would have the impression that partly the our archipelagic character contributed to this diversity. However, we have shared cultural heritage as well. It really doesn't mean that we are different from each other. So there are basically two racial stocks in the country. If we're using phenotypic criteria, so Negrito populations and the Austronesian speaking populations. In terms of languages, almost all Philippine languages, with the exception of Chabacano and Filipino Sign Language, are part of the Western Malayo-Polynesian subfamily of the Austronesian family of languages. In the historic and prehistoric past, Philippine society was made up of riverine and maritime communities. So houses were built on stilts along riverbanks and along coastal areas. However, there was trade relationship among different islands and between lowland and upland groups. So cultural traits coming from lowland seep in into the highlands and vice versa. And across different islands of the country, as well as in different parts of the region, such as Southeast Asia and East Asia. So it's not really uh, isolated communities, but we are linked with one another. So I mentioned the Austronesian peoples. So if this is a map of the world, showing the distribution of Austronesian speaking populations in the world. So from Easter Island in the east, or Rapa Nui, which is now part of Chile, to Madagascar in Africa. And you will notice that the Philippines is more or less centrally located because according to Peter Bellwood, a linguist, um, and an archaeologist. So the Austronesian peoples came from mainland Asia at the border of modern day Thailand and China, went down into Taiwan, and jumped into the Philippines and bifurcated into two groups. One group going into Oceania, consisting of Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia, all the way to uh, New Zealand and Chile, as I mentioned, and the other group going as far as Madagascar in Africa. So we will notice that our languages are very, very similar with one another. For example, you mentioned the word anak. So it's also anak or anak in many Austronesian languages. And why were Austronesian peoples able to spread this vast territory? It's because the Austronesians are attributed to the invention of the outrigger boat o yung bangkang may katig. So we know, for example, Native Americans had their canoes. The Inuit or Eskimos had their kayaks. But all of these native vessels don't have an outrigger, which did not enable them to go into far-flung areas, crossing the seas and oceans. So being connected with the maritime world is actually as an Austronesian legacy. So according to Bellwood, he used the postulations of Robert Blust. Peter Bellwood forwards the view that Austronesians spread to Southeast Asia from South China via Formosa or Taiwan and to the Philippines. From the Philippines and northern Indonesia, Austronesians were bifurcated, one branch going westwards. I already mentioned this. Okay? However, there is another hypothesis uh, coming from Wilhelm Solheim. I'll talk about that later. So the Austronesian family of languages consists of at least two subfamilies. The Malayo-Polynesian languages, many of us are familiar with this, and Formosan languages, the languages in Taiwan. That is why it is assumed that Formosan languages, the languages of Aboriginal peoples of Taiwan, are much older than Malayo-Polynesian languages. So you will see here the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, all speaking Malayo-Polynesian languages. However, you will notice some parts of Vietnam, the red portion, actually this is Champa or the Cham peoples of central Vietnam. How is it possible that uh, a group of people from Vietnam speak an Austronesian language just like those in the Philippines and Indonesia? Of course, the connection was through the seas, and also earlier kingdoms in the region such as Champa and Majapahit were connected because of this sea routes. The other hypothesis comes from Wilhelm Solheim. Right now, I won't take a stand in the debate because that is not the purpose of our presentation. However, Solheim also highlights the maritime context of the Nusantao, what he called the Nusantao peoples. So Wilhelm Solheim II disagrees with Peter Bellwood in the view that Taiwan was part of the Austronesian movement. He said that pre-Austronesians might have originated in eastern Indonesia and southern Mindanao. So it's not from Taiwan, but from the southern part of the Philippines. And he called this the Nusantao people. Nusan, ibig sabihin, south, the islands, Tao. Okay? So he identified the Nusantao as a maritime-oriented culture as represented by the Bajau of Tawi-Tawi. living in houseboats or houses built on stilts in the seas or along coastal areas. Okay, so let us look at the Summerbajao peoples of the Philippines. Actually, they're not just found in the Philippines. Their traditional homeland is the tri-border of Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines, Sulawesi in Indonesia, and Sabah in Malaysia. So the picture on the right shows the Bajau houseboat known as the Lepa, and they move about uh, through a moorage group or a cluster of different lepa moving from island to island. Some peoples of this region are already settled in land areas, such as the Bajau of Sabah live, they're recognized as horsemen within Sabah, and basically their way of life is in the land. However, just like the Sama of Tawi-Tawi, different from the Sama Dilaut or the Bajau, they live on houses built on stilts. Okay. Now, based on folkloric traditions, and of course, I would like to stress that this is folklore and would not necessarily have a factual historical basis, such as the legend of the 10 Bornean Datus. The anthropologist H. Oatley Bayer used this story of the 10 Bornean Datus as a proof of his theory of the waves of migration. He used other folkloric and pseudo-historical evidences, the maragtas, which is now disproven as fact, to back up the story of 10 Bornean Datus. However, in anthropology, we recognize that folklore is indeed part of culture. People would develop their own stories as to where they came from. And in this story, these Borneans came to the country, to the Philippines, riding boats known as barangay or balanghay or balangay, which is more or less accurate. The 10 Bornean datus only as a symbolic representation of early peoples that have migrated to the country, into the Philippines and outside the Philippines. So, for example, of course, the term barangay later on became associated with settlements led by a datu. Now, if we go back to the Bajau, therefore, folkloric tradition would say they originated from Johor in Malaysia. One time at night, they tied their houseboats in a rock protruding at the sea. But when they woke up in the morning, they found out that they're now in Tawi-Tawi because this was actually not a rock, but a giant sea turtle. Again, we know there's no factual evidence for this, but it is a folklore that people believe where their traditions came from. Okay, so the seas connected us with one another. In pre-colonial Philippine society, the seas were not the barriers in the flow of peoples from one direction to the other. On the contrary, the seas served as the major highways during that time. Of course, in pre-colonial Philippines, we didn't have a wheel based on land. What we had was the pasagad, for example, being pulled by a carabao. But in terms of boat traditions, we have a lot. So if we look at this map of the Visayas, you will see, for example, Negros Island, where the western part, that is Negros Occidental, Ilonggo speaking, just like uh, Iloilo across the sea. And the eastern part, that's Negros Oriental, Cebuano speaking, just like Cebu and Bohol. So the seas were not the barriers. What the barriers are were the mountain ranges that crossed Negros Island. This is repeated in many parts of the archipelago. For example, in Luzon, we have Batangas as a province, and across in Mindoro, we have a group of Mangyans who call themselves Batangan because in the pre-colonial past, they were one people. What about the rivers? The rivers connected inland waters such as the lakes to the seas. For example, the Pasig River connected the Laguna Lake with Manila Bay. In the very, very long past, the seawater from Manila Bay flows into Laguna Lake during the dry season, while during the wet season, the water from Laguna Lake drains into Manila Bay. That is why Laguna Lake was then constantly uh, uh, had a rich source of salt water, which was favorable to the fish in the area. However, during the time of the Marcos dictatorship, they set up the Mangahan floodway, the Napindan Dam, and this uh, blocked the flow uh, of the Pasig River to drain into Manila Bay because Marcos didn't want Malacanang to be flooded. Okay, so this is a list of several watercrafts in the study of Ricardo Galang in 1941. So I have the manuscript here. Galang of the National Museum then looked at various archival sources that mentioned watercrafts in the Philippines. I won't be able to discuss all of them because I have very limited time. So it's the type of boats is spelled out alphabetically from A to Z, and you will see there are indeed many types of watercrafts in the country. Some of the names are obviously Spanish. I did not remove them from the list because we know that even during the Spanish colonial period, there were instances where indigenous crafts, indigenous cuisine, and other traditional items adopted Spanish names. So we would have to investigate whether they indeed were of indigenous origin or introduced by the Spanish, or was it just the name that was introduced? So from Galang's work, this is a plate showing the picture above is the barangay, which was described in historical sources as a sharp, slender craft pointed at both ends and put together with wooden nails and pegs and propelled by oars and sails. And it was widespread in the archipelago, even among uh, the isnags of Apayao. Their boat, which is inland in the Apayao River, is called barangay. The picture below is a casco. So it's a long, almost rectangular barge, or lighter than a barge, sometimes with sails, and principally used for loading merchandise. So, for example, I live in Pasig, And one of the old rivers in Pasig, now a creek, is the Parian River, or what we call Bitukang Manok. And many of the heritage houses along the Bitukang Manok had a quote-unquote garage for a casco. Now, of course, there is no use for these garages. Now, let us look at different facets of life of early Filipinos prior to the coming of the colonizers and upon the coming of the colonizers. So, we know that pre-colonial houses were built on stilts, just like the Sama. The picture on the left are houses on stilts in Davao Oriental. And even our pambansang bahay, the Nipa hut, is house built on stilt, but now it's based mainly on land. But the tradition originated and evolved from houses along riverbanks and along coastal areas. Many peoples of the Philippines, in terms of their ethnic names, are marked by their water origins, whether the seas or the rivers or the lakes. Various peoples of the Philippines have been called as Tagalog, or people of the river, Kapampangan, people of the coast, Dumagat, people of the sea, Subanon, people of the river. Suba in Visayan languages means river. Tausug, people of the current. Maranao, Ranao meaning lake, people of the lake. Iraya Mangyan and Iraya Isnag, people of the upstream. So we will see that water bodies are really seen as very important for early Filipinos. What about food? Traditionally, Filipinos or pre-colonial Filipinos and continuing up to the present, we eat rice as staple food and traditionally fish. Rice, which Tagalogs call kanin, comes from the word kainin, which means to eat. Therefore, to have rice means you are eating. If you're not having rice, then nagpapapak ka. Hindi ka kumakain. Okay? If you're eating a particular dish, not with rice, but with liquor, namumulutan ka at hindi ka kumakain. Fish, among the Tagalogs, is called isda. But let us look at a cognate in the Ilocano language, sida, which means ulam. So to have ulam is to have fish. And of course, Jose Rizal mentioned that among his favorite dishes was sinigang na ayungin, the fish coming from Laguna Lake. But ayungin is now extinct in Laguna Lake. The picture on the right is a mid-19th century photograph from painting, Jose Honorato Lozano, showing how Filipinos ate then with rice, sitting on the ground, having the dulang or the low table, and of course, rice being served. What about washing and bathing? So according to Jean Malat, a French geographer who wrote about the Indios of the Philippines, he said, the Indios, men as well as women, take the greatest care in everything that has to do with cleanliness of the body, and perhaps the former, meaning the men, more than the latter, more than the women. They take a bath and wash themselves every day in the river and at least twice a week at home. For them, it is a pleasure as well as a need. And we will see here a turn of the century photograph of people washing clothes, as well as bathing along the Pasig River. Now, why is this mentioned by Mala? Mala is a Frenchman. And the French don't take a bath every day. They just put perfumes on their body. So for them, this is something new. Why do people take a bath every day? The importance of the river is seen in this description. And of course, aside from taking a bath every day in the river, once they go home, at least twice a week, they take a bath at home using the banga or the jar filled in with water and using a tabo made of coconut shell and gugo used as shampoo. The river was also the location where male circumcision rituals were performed. In traditional Philippine society, Filipino males were circumcised. Circumcision was not introduced by the Spanish, but this was a pre-colonial tradition. The Spanish were not circumcised, they were supot. So that's why Filipinos laughed at the Spanish. Male circumcision rituals were usually performed beside the rivers. After the foreskin of the penis is cut, of course, you spit chewed guava leaves on your penis and then jump into the river to be cleansed. And the picture on the right shows how the pukpok ritual is performed. Of course, many millennials and those of Generation Z uh, are no longer familiar with this ritual. Why is it called a ritual? Because it's a rite of passage to manhood, and only males could observe it. Females are forbidden to watch this ritual because it is believed that once a woman sees you being circumcised, then it will be nangangamatis or it will swell. Uh, so I mentioned that I live in Pasig. Members of the generation of my parents were circumcised beside the Pasig River and jumped into the river. However, in my generation, we could no longer do that because the Pasig River is already polluted and you could die by jumping into the river. Now, there were many stories also about the rivers that were connected to the seas. This story comes from an Isinay story of Aritao in Nueva Vizcaya. So it tells a story about a river Sirena. Now, why is this interesting? We know that the concept of a mermaid or sirena was borrowed from the Spanish, from the European sirena. However, European mermaids were found in the seas and not along the river. But in the Philippines, in Cagayan River, as well as in other rivers in the island, and in the archipelago have been located along the rivers because the rivers are connected to the seas. Burial tradition. So let me go fast here because I have little time left. We will see from the Manunggul jar circa 890 BC that the lid that covers the jar, the secondary burial jar, shows the dead crossing his arms being brought to the afterlife using a boat. Okay? So the afterlife or yung kabilang buhay ay is reached through a river connected to the seas, and then you reach the afterlife. Here is an example of boat-shaped burials in Batanes. The dead is buried inside a secondary burial covered by a heap of stones, but the heap of stones are shaped like boats, again representing the belief that the dead will go to the afterlife, emulating their ancestors who are seafarers. Now, what changes have occurred due to colonization and modernization? There was a gradual shift and to a certain degree a forced shift from coastal and riverine communities to land-based towns or pueblos. The Spanish didn't want that early Filipino communities were strongly influenced by the rule of the datus as well as the influence of the Babaylan, the shamans, the indigenous shamans. So they built pueblos from far from the rivers and the seas. And if you remain in old settlements, it would show as if that your loyalty is with the Babaylan and not with the Spanish. So that was why the earliest revolts were the Babaylan revolts. The Spanish also established road networks and land transportation systems. They brought the wheel in the Philippine setting. On the contrary, sea transportation gradually declined. It was not eradicated by the Spanish because there was a galleon trade, but there was the establishment of port areas in Cavite, in Manila, in Zamboanga, but eventually there was a decline because of the presence of land transportation and bridges and the tranvia, etc. But towards the American period and in the post-colonial era, we could see the eventual death of the maritime industry, especially the shipbuilding industry. In the past, the Philippines was known to build ships, but now we don't have this industry anymore. The industry that we have is to produce seamen that are sent abroad, but in terms of building ships and ocean vessels, uh, we have lagged behind in this endeavor. And of course, one impact of of modernization in particular is the pollution of rivers and creeks and rendering river transportation and sea transportation impractical and useless. So the river ferry, for example, along the Pasig River has become dead. There has been several instances that they wanted to revive it, but it's no longer there. And now, even they wanted to introduce building a road network known as the Parex on top of the Pasig River, practically uh, impacting on the Pasig River as a cultural heritage site. So here are my concluding remarks. Many facets, many culture traits of part of that were part of Philippine culture evolved from our maritime roots. However, many of the acculturated Filipino have become divorced from these roots. Because of this, our maritime industry has largely remained underdeveloped. If we want to redeem Philippine culture and identity, there is a need for us to redeem as well our connectedness with the maritime world and the maritime worldview that Filipinos have. So with this, thank you very much. And here are my references from Bayer, Castro, Galang, Mala, etc. If you have questions and comments, you could write it at the chat box. If we don't have much time, you could send me an email at mtcastro1 at up.edu.ph. You could also watch my videos at YouTube. Look for Nestor Castro. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nestor Castro, for that very interesting presentation. So, our second speaker is a notable economic historian. He is an assistant professor at the University of the Philippines History Department. He finished his bachelor's degree in economics and his master's in history degree at the University of the Philippines, Diliman also. He regularly writes articles, presents papers, and engages in research on the history of the Philippine economic institutions, particularly transportation. Today, he will share to us his insights as an economic historian in the maritime domain. Everyone, it is my honor to welcome Mr. Carl Friedrich K. Poblador. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Daryl, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to this forum. And I'd like to welcome all the members of the audience, especially the students of the Asian Institute of Maritime Studies. And congratulations also, and thank you to Dr. Castro for the presentation that preceded mine. Okay. When I was given an invitation to give a 30-minute presentation about Philippine economic history, I was thinking about what theme I will focus on. But definitely, I will have to have a focus on maritime transport. Okay, why? Because throughout economic history, maritime transport has been the invisible element, okay, of Philippine trade and Philippine economic activity. Okay, in fact, if you look at your surroundings now, the clothes you're wearing, the laptops you're using, your cell phones, okay, the construction materials used for whatever dwelling you're staying at, okay, all the materials there, whether in its finished form or in its raw form, traveled on a ship in one way or another. So this is how I'll be framing my presentation. I'll try my best to give a linear narrative that is, a narrative of Philippine economic history in chronological order, starting from the pre-colonial era up to the present. I will be discussing this within the context of external trade. And in some cases, I will give a description of the political environment because if you frame history around the political economy, political institutions matter as much as economic institutions as far as continuity and change in the Philippine economy is concerned. Okay. Okay. This is a map of the Srivijayan Empire. Dr. Castro mentioned earlier about the Austronesian influences, cultural influences in the Philippines. And it is through the trade network that centered around the Srivijayan Empire, which is, by the way, this is now present-day Indonesia and Malaysia, and this is the Straits of Malacca right here. It is through these networks that cultural influences from China and India went into the Philippines, despite the fact that the Philippines, you can see the tip of Palawan here, is not really part of the main network, okay? But nonetheless, it was a feeder trade route, so to speak, for the main trade that took place in the Srivijayan Empire, okay? Which actually had a very strong navy, okay? But eventually, the Srivijayan Empire declined due to piracy, and it was replaced by the Majapahit Empire, which thrived in what is now present-day Indonesia. That is until the establishments of the Muslim sultanates. And it is through this network that, we had concepts of Raha and Bathala and even a system of writing, okay? So this is how the Austronesian culture of the Filipino people at the time became further enriched with outside influences. And of course, aside from cultural influences, you also had trade, okay, which entered through that network. And in this painting about pre-Hispanic Philippines by Randy Solon, it's a mishmash of different elements of Philippine pre-colonial culture. You can see the Panday sa Putao, okay, the blacksmith. You can see pottery. And of course, you can see traders, with the Chinese traders here trading Philippine silk. And the goods that were traded by Filipinos to the Chinese were usually forest products, kaya may usa dito, okay? And here you can see some of the traditional homes that Dr. Castro described earlier. And if you look at the top here, of course, you have what was then a typical Philippine watercraft at the time, right? Now, this is a representation from Spanish sources of a caracoa. As you can see, it has the outriggers that Dr. Castro mentioned as typical in Filipino watercraft. And now the caracoa is actually a warship, okay, used for slave raiding across the Visayan Islands. Now, if I'm giving you a lecture about economic history, what does this have to do about warfare? Well, actually, the act of warfare itself is actually an economic activity, because the purpose of slave raiding around the Visayas regions was actually to acquire slaves, which served as laborers. Sila yung mga naging uripon, or the commoners, so to speak, in pre-colonial Philippine society. Now, a more sophisticated network of slave raiding emanated from Sulu. Okay, in particular, the Samal Balangagi, okay, from Sulu, had a very sophisticated network of slave trading, which Southeast Asian historian James Warren describes as the Sulu zone. Okay, and here you can see their slave raiding network, which extends across what is now present-day Indonesia, and it actually made inroads well into the Visayas and Mindanao, even during the Spanish colonial period. Okay, and for the Sultanate of Sulu, slave raiding was actually a very lucrative economic activity. There was a slave trade. They sold slaves, around the different sultanates in what is now present-day Indonesia. And as we'll be discussing later on, one of those famous slaves was Enrique of Moluccas. Okay. Now, these slaves were used in industries such as pearl diving and harvesting, but they also served as servants for the Muslim elites. And here you will see a watercraft which they use, which does not have outriggers, okay, but has a net, but is manned by oarsmen, okay. This gave the watercraft, in combination with the sail, remarkable speed, so it's very intimidating, actually, even for the Spaniards who were manning forts in colonial Philippines to see the raids of the Samal Balangagi or the Iranun, okay, who was another well-known ethnic group who conducted slave raiding. Now, outside of the Sulu zone, the traditional maritime heritage that was a part of the Visayan culture, okay, was basically cut off with the arrival of the Spaniards. As Dr. Castro mentioned earlier, the Spaniards created a system of pueblos in which the encomenderos and the friar orders created a sense of social order within their colony, and inter-island trade and external trade, among pre-colonial Filipinos practically stopped. But the Chinese trade with the Philippines did persist through the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, right? Now, the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade was the main lifeline between the Philippines as a Spanish colony and Nueva España, or New Spain, which was in Acapulco. And the main trade goods on the Manila-Acapulco galleons was Chinese silk in exchange for Mexican silver, which was the currency which was very much in demand in China at the time, all right? So here you can see a Chinese junk, okay? They usually deliver their goods to Manila in the Parian quarters, where the Chinese Sangley traders were residing, and that's where they conducted their commerce with the Spanish colonizers in Intramuros. This is the route of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. Okay, it was discovered by Fray Andres de Urdaneta while he was in captivity in the Moluccas. He observed the currents, and it was through this northern route that the Spaniards were finally able to find the way back to Nueva España, or the seat of the Viceroyalty of Mexico here in Acapulco. Okay. Previously, whenever Spanish expeditions arrived in the Philippines, they tried to leave through the San Bernardino Strait, but they just ended up getting pushed down the Moluccas. No? So when Fray Andres de Urdaneta finally took the first voyage in 1565 to return to Acapulco, that's when the constancy of return trips of the galleons started. Now, of course, since this was the only connection that the Philippines had with Spain for practically 3 centuries, it was also the only means of cultural exchange. So it was also through the galleon trade that, you know, certain elements of our culture, such as chocolate, coffee, tobacco, even tomatoes, right, became part of our cultural heritage. Now, aside from the galleon trade, which was actually already in decline by the late 18th century, because by the late 18th century, Spain was no longer monopolizing the expansion of European empires into the Far East. So from the late 18th century onward, the Philippines needed another source of income. And it was through the tobacco monopoly that was completely managed by the colonial government that, you know, the Philippines was successfully able to sell its first lucrative export commodity, right? But of course, as it turned out, tobacco was also consumed strongly by the local population. Now, through the cultivation of tobacco, a lot of provinces, especially in northern Luzon, developed. In fact, the province of Isabela was established because of the tobacco monopoly. Even up to now, tobacco is planted in the Ilocos region. And of course, you don't just plant tobacco, you have to harvest it and transport it, and you have to process it into cigars. And that is the reason why Binondo became a very prosperous part of Manila during this period. Now, yes, the Filipino shipbuilding tradition ceased during the Spanish period, but since tobacco was transported through the river systems, the Cagayan River and into the Pasig, okay, you can see in this graphic here that the casco still being used, right? Now, as far as the tobacco monopoly is concerned, every part of the process was actually managed by the Spanish colonial government, except one aspect: water transport, okay? So it is through water transport that a lot of Chinese actually were able to get into the water transport business during the period of the tobacco monopoly. Now, a major shift in Philippine trade with the outside world would take place after the galleon trade ended and after the Spanish Empire in South America began to collapse. When Mexico became independent, the galleon trade ceased. And for the Philippine economy to prosper, a new form of external trade was needed. And that took place when the Philippines finally entered the world market for export commodities following the opening of Manila to world trade in 1834. Prior to that, only Spanish ships had the exclusive right to enter Manila. But from 1834 onwards, you had British, American, French, and even Danish steamships, well, steamships later on, entering Manila Bay to trade. And what products were in high demand? Well, first of all, abaca became a commodity in high demand because of the need for cordage in the maritime industry, which was on the rise in Europe and the United States during the 19th century. And a British diplomat who came to the Philippines also developed the Iloilo Negros sugar economy. And from the time that Iloilo opened up to world trade in 1855 or so, it also enriched the mestizo population of Iloilo, who up to now thrive as the descendants of the Senderos. Now, the colonial export economy was not exclusive to the Spanish period, right? It actually extended well into the period of American occupation. And two laws that were enacted by the US Congress practically paved the way for the massive growth of the export of various agricultural goods with the United States practically as an exclusive trading partner. We have the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act in 1909, which provided free entry to the United States of all Filipino products except rice, sugar, and tobacco. And that was followed in 1913 by the Underwood-Simmons Act, which removed all quotas on Philippine exports and to the United States, and likewise also for Philippine imports from the United States. So we had a total free trade relationship with America, which thrived well into the pre-war years. In fact, by 1939, 85% of all exports from the Philippines were going to the United States. And of course, with the growth of trade, shipping always follows trade. Trade always produces an induced demand for shipping. Now, this type of ship is called a lorcha. Its design is actually the combination of European hull design, yung katawan niya, European style, but the design of the sails is based on the Chinese sampan. And this was used to transport sugar from Negros to the port of Iloilo. And this design was actually promoted by the British diplomat Nicholas Loney. And this is a scene in Manila, at the port of Manila at the end of the 19th century. This is at the mouth of the Pasig River. This is where all the, so as you can see cascos and a variety of small watercraft, as well as larger steamers. Now, to give you an idea of the impact of the colonial trade on the bottom line, the finances of the Philippines as a colony from 1846, you can see how it grew, up until 1920. And these were the products that were traded. We have abaca. This is a sugar central. And this is the production of copra. And eventually, the Philippines would also be exporting logs and mineral products. But during the American colonial period, the mineral product that was mainly mined was gold, and since the gold was actually smelted, processed in Philippine gold mines, it did not really produce an induced demand for shipping. Okay, unlike copra. As you can see here, this is a postcard showing a steamer owned by Compañía Marítima. Now, Compañía Marítima was the biggest Philippine-owned liner company. It was formed in 1894, and it only went into decline during the late 70s, right? So it survived for almost 100 years. And in this postcard, aside from the passengers on deck, you can see that copra is being prepared to be loaded, okay? In fact, the main demand for inter-island vessels was because of the copra trade. There are actually a lot of narratives in which, copra is actually parked. There isn't enough cargo space for loading copra, that they actually had to load copra on the decks of the ships alongside the passengers. Okay, now this is a more contemporary picture of the port of Manila and the mouth of the Pasig River. These are some Compañía Marítima steamers parked at the mouth of the Pasig. Now, why the mouth of the Pasig? Because during this time, there was still no North Harbor. The project for the development of the North Harbor would only begin in 1938. So during this time, up until then, all the domestic shipping traffic, okay, tried as much as possible to park alongside at the mouth of the Pasig River. That is unlike the South Harbor, which was the docking area for foreign vessels. And here you can see the Empress liners, which were the biggest ocean liners at the time, parked alongside the famous Pier 7, which gained a reputation as one of the best ports in the Far East. Okay, and here actually you can see in the background the Manila Hotel and Luneta, and there's Intramuros. Okay, why am I showing you a picture of Manuel Alcazon, right? I would just like to emphasize that Manuel Alcazon is actually more than just the image on your 20 peso note or 20 peso coin, and more than the Ama ng Wikang Pambansa, okay? His role in creating Philippine economic institutions is very profound. One of his first acts as president of the Philippine Commonwealth, which was the transitory government from the American colonial period into the Philippine Independent Republic. One of his first acts as president of the Philippine Commonwealth was to create the National Economic Council, which had the responsibility of planning a post-independence Philippine economy, right? And among its members were Vicente Madrigal and Ramon Fernandez, who happened to be the owner of Compañía Marítima, the biggest liner company in the Philippines. Now, what am I driving at here? Okay, now as early as the time of Quezon, you could see that personalities who were part of the business community were also having roles in government, and by extension it was very important to have close connections to the president in order for your business to thrive. Now, one close associate of the president, President Quezon, was Negros Ascendero and Senator Esteban de la Rama, the owner of de la Rama Shipping. And because of his political position and association, he was given the privilege of purchasing brand new ships for ocean-going trade, despite the fact that there was a very limited budget from the government, okay? And here I'm showing you a photograph of one of the 4 brand new ships that he purchased from Italy. This is the Doña Nati. Now, the Doña Nati actually has a very remarkable role in Philippine military history, because during the Japanese invasion, when the Japanese Navy blockaded the seas surrounding the Philippines at the start of the Second World War in the Philippines in 1942, the Doña Nati was only one of 3 ships that was able to break the blockade and deliver supplies to the Philippines at the start of the war. Okay, so with that feat of heroism, okay, De La Rama Shipping would actually have the privilege of continuing this ocean-going shipping venture after the war. Okay. Now, this is the port of Manila right after the Japanese occupation. And here it is occupied by US Navy vessels in August 1945. And they were actually preparing to use the Philippines as a jump-off point for the invasion of Japan. Okay, but that did not push through because of the use of the atomic bomb, which ended the war much earlier. In any case, soon after, okay, the Philippine independence was recognized by the United States on July 4th, 1946. And since the Philippines was devastated by the damage caused by the war, okay, it was able to get support from the United States. Well, of course, in exchange for other unfair treaties, through the Philippine Rehabilitation Act of 1946, and which provided $620 million, which is a very large amount at the time. And part of the Philippine Rehabilitation Act was the provision for the disposal of surplus property for commercial use. Now, this is a very significant milestone in Philippine inter-island shipping, because among those surplus properties that the US was disposing of were the freight and service, or FS ships, that were used by the US military, and they were converted to mixed passenger and cargo use. And because of the availability of these ships, okay, several companies were able to deploy their own inter-island fleet and challenge Compañía Maritima. And I'm not sure if your generation is familiar with these brands, but I'm sure your parents are. This is the logo of William Lines, Gotong Lines, and Aboitiz Shipping. Okay, I think I have 3 minutes left, so I'll be rushing through the rest of my lecture. So this is a summary of major turning points in Philippine economic history from the 1960s onwards. Now, the Philippines actually had the highest per capita GDP in Southeast Asia during the 1960s, but the plan of Carlos P. Garcia to create a Philippine industrial base failed, and that was replaced by a regime of export promotion, which started during the time of Diosdado Macapagal. And yes, there was continued growth until the time of President Marcos. But during the Marcos years onwards, take note that a lot of that growth had to be driven by debt. Okay. So let me just give you a very brief, a single slide here to briefly explain the reality of the economic experience during the time of Marcos. Yes, there was massive government spending and a lot of exports in 1973, but that was very temporary because the only way that Marcos was able to sustain economic growth and development and the construction of infrastructure was through massive borrowing, in which loans increased from 2.6 billion in 1975 to 25 billion by 1983. And look how the peso devalued during that time. Okay, there was also widespread crony capitalism. Crony capitalism meaning giving business favorable business deals to your friends, and this was the context in which dubious personalities actually obtained ocean-going shipping assets, which proved to be very useless. Okay, and this is also, and because of the economic difficulties, this is also the start of direct government support for the deployment of migrant labor, of course, including seafarers. Okay, I just want to show you this slide to dispel the myth that the Philippines was the second richest economy in Asia after Japan, because even in Southeast Asia during the martial law period, okay, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, and even Indonesia were already ahead of us. Although sa Indonesia mag-iiba-iba yan, right? But throughout this period, Malaysia and Thailand were already ahead of us. Of course, you can give Singapore the excuse. Also take note of the transformation in Philippine exports. Now, these were the traditional exports which started during the Spanish colonial period, and they were already declining because the Philippines was actually developing into a manufacturer of electronics and electronic equipment and garments. Okay. In fact, right now, our chief export is still electronic products, in case you don't know. Now, unfortunately, one export that was promoted during the Marcos time, and I say unfortunately, is this item here, forest products, was the most massive deforestation of primary growth forests in the Philippines took place during his regime. And of course, logging also created an induced demand for shipping. And I met the owner of Magsaysay Shipping, and she's very proud of this picture because it shows a picture of one of Magsaysay Shipping's bulk carriers carrying logs through Venice. Okay. Okay, let's go. Of course, here's the economic decline during the period of Marcos. And of course, nothing much happened during the time of Cory Aquino because, it was her task to help the country get back on its feet after the decline of Philippine economy during the previous regime. And growth started to take place during the time of Fidel Ramos because he actually liberalized the economy. As a result, manufacturing closed down due to poor competitiveness. But he allowed for the greater entry of foreign investment. Okay. And because of the liberalization agenda of Fidel Ramos, there was actually a real threat that the business of William Lines, Gotong Lines, and Aboitiz Shipping would be threatened by foreign competition. So in order to pool their capital and create a more powerful business entity, they merged into what was then WG&A, and they're of course famous for deploying the famous super ferry ships. Now, super ferry is not there anymore. Of course, you all know this as To Go, which is now owned by the SM Investments Corporation. All right. So this single slide here also shows you the nature of Philippine capitalism, in which old companies with venerable traditions, are actually just renamed and acquired by new capitalists who never really created anything new, no? But of course, when we talk about the shipping industry, we don't only talk about ships, and we don't only talk about capital. We don't only talk about trade. We also talk about manpower. Okay. And of course, at the entrance of the museum, I think there's a statue of Enrique de Malacca, okay, who was the seafarer who accompanied Magellan on his expedition to the Philippines and assisted in translating Visayan languages, right? We would like to believe that he actually came from one of the Visayan islands, although new research from using primary sources actually points to the fact that he might have come elsewhere from what is now present-day Indonesia. But regardless of where Enrique de Malacca was really from, okay, there's no denying, the contribution of the Filipino seafarer to the Philippine economy. Okay, 380,000 Filipino mariners made up a quarter of merchant shipping crews in 2019 and remitted $6 billion in 2018. Okay. Now, unfortunately, we could not rest on this reality because China actually recently knocked the Philippines from the top spot as the biggest single source of seafarers in the world. And the deployment of Filipino mariners is actually falling, of course, especially due to the COVID pandemic. But of course, if you look further into the future, okay, beyond the ships, beyond the human capital, right? Okay, trade will always take place. Okay, these are the major trade routes in the world, and just imagine, in all of these trade routes, okay, a Filipino seafarer has the responsibility of ensuring that the ship carrying the goods around the world, reaches its destination. But then again, probably during our lifetimes, this reality could change. Very recently, I came across this article on CNN, and I've actually watched a few videos. Now, this is a crewless cargo ship, which is operated using artificial intelligence. And I think they're going to be sailing this somewhere in Norway. And of course, according to economic historian Joel Mokyr, technological change also has a very huge role in the development of world economies. And this is probably one reality which the Philippines would have to get used to. Well, fortunately, if the Philippines also has a very large pool of talent as far as artificial intelligence is concerned, and just as we have done from the pre-colonial times that were discussed by Dr. Castro earlier, of course, we would be able to adapt to these conditions. And with that, I end my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carpoblador, for that very insightful and informative presentation. There was a lot of facts that was presented to us, which was really unknown to the majority of us. So for our final speaker, he is a well-known international affairs commentator. He frequently appears in different media outlets and writes articles on major news sites. He is a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation and a member of the board of directors of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. He was a lecturer at the Chinese Studies program of Ateneo de Manila University and the International Studies Department of De La Salle University, Manila. He obtained his Master's of Laws from Peking University, and today he will share to us his insights on maritime issues of the Philippines. Everyone, it is my honor to welcome Mr. Lucio Blanco Pila III. Sir, thank you.
ng volume.
Sir Lucio, I think there was a... Hindi ko kayo marinig, sir. Apo.
Naka-unmute pero walang hindi na connect yung mic.
Ayan po, sir. Nakikita na kayo, sir. Sir, wala pa rin pong sound. Sensya na po. I think may technical lang po. Probably sa mic po siguro, sir.
Can you hear me better?
Sir, I think nakamute po kayo. Sir Lucio po. And sir, naka-unmute na po kayo, sir. Baka okay na po, sir, yung sound po natin.
Good morning. Thank you again.
Sir Lucio, I think we still have some problem with the sound. Probably may other po tayo, earphones that we can use. Apo.
Yes, hello, good morning.
Ay, sorry, okay na po.
Is the microphone better now?
Okay na po. Yes po, sir. Thank you po, sir.
Okay. Hold on. Hold on. I'll try to get I'll try to adjust the new microphone. Sorry.
Okay po. So while we wait po muna for the technical, while we fix po the technical issues, I would just like to give a comment lang po on some of our initial presentation po na, from Dr. Nestor and Mr. Carl. I hope po of our participants and viewers have seen the interplay between the maritime features of our country and the anthropological and economic development that we have become as a nation state. So from Dr. Nestor, we have clearly seen po that the seas does not serve as a barrier, rather it serves as an highway po. It's actually became a link between different cultures and nations po for our country, between different cultures and a barangay for our country. And as we have seen, the maritime features of our country became a crucial part in the nation state development of our country. So from the barangay, though the Spaniards created more of a pueblo and a land-based development model, but we have clearly seen that during the American period, as we expand on trade, we have adopted a more international outlook through our maritime domain. Okay po, so I think Sir Lucio is now available po. Sige po. And then while continuing lang din po for some of our reflections, so we have clearly seen an interplaying po between the Spanish nation building and the maritime features of our country. So continuing po right now, Mr. Lucio po will give us our maritime issues po concerning the South China Sea and other maritime issues po. Sir, thank you po. Sige po. So as of now, while we're still waiting po muna for Sir Lucio, there were also some just question. Meron lang po mga question in our chat box right now. We'll just try to accommodate po muna some questions for our first two speakers. So right now, for our first question, for your others po na may question, we'll entertain some question na lang po because of time constraint. And if possible, i-type nyo na lang po sa chat box. Then we'll just synthesize na lang po. So for our question is number one. This can be answered po by both of our initial speakers. What significant role does maritime culture and heritage play in stressing Philippine sovereignty? So ideally, this can actually be covered po by all of our speakers. But right now po, si Sir Carl and Dr. Nestor, what's your take po on this?
Yeah, so in my presentation, I stressed that maritime culture is indeed very much ingrained in our Filipino identity. So this is really a very strong issue for many Filipinos, especially our fisher folk, who are very much offended by intrusions into the West Philippine Sea. So, so I would say that it indeed plays an important role, we should really assert our sovereignty over our seas, uh, including those in our exclusive economic zone.
Sige sir, thank you very much po. Right now, Mr. Carl Poblador, what's your question po on take po on that regarding the role of our maritime heritage in relation po to our maritime sovereignty?
Okay, from the perspective of colonial history, okay, one thing I could say about our sovereignty is that this was established as early as the Spanish colonial period. Okay, in fact, the Murillo Valerde map of 1734, you can clearly see, okay, the territorial baselines of the Philippines there. And during the period of American occupation, okay, this was actually upheld by the American colonial government. So from the colonial experience alone, all right, Philippine territory had already been established, and I guess this is one of the strongest institutions that we inherited from our colonial past. Because prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, okay, there was no Republic of the Philippines to speak of whatsoever. Okay, what we had were different pre-colonial chiefdoms, and the strongest political center was actually the Sultanate of Sulu. Okay, and because of the arrival of the Spaniards, yan, nabuo na yung Republika, yung mapa ng Pilipinas. And that geographic representation alone, all right, which is supported by a lot of cartographic evidence, even constructed by the US military, okay, is something that we are upholding up to the 21st century.
Okay, thank you for your answers, Sir Carl. For the second question, so this from DSMT 21B5. So the question is, had there been much help from the government in the past rendered to develop economy, especially in coastal communities of the Philippines, to make them sustainable these days?
I think that's addressed to you, Professor Poblador.
Okay, yeah. What I can answer is I could give you an answer about efforts of the Philippine government to develop the shipping industry. Okay. What the shipping industry expects from the government is actually, one thing is infrastructure. Okay. And ironically, a lot of the infrastructure was constructed, during the American colonial period. In fact, what is presently the foundation of both the Manila North and South Harbor was actually constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, right after the end of the Second World War. And having said that, another form of support which has been lacking from the government, of course, is financial support. In fact, domestic shipping in particular, basically they're left to their own to generate their own capital. Now, one thing that the government, in my opinion, lost focus on since the time of Manuel Alcazon is that instead of supporting the domestic shipping industry, they had a goal of creating a national merchant marine, because the Philippines was exporting agricultural products, but most of the ships that were used to export these products were members of the conferences, mainly dominated by American liner companies. So there was actually a noble idea of creating a national merchant marine, but unfortunately, since the time of Quezon, it has been politicized, marred by corruption among various cronies and government institutions, which I won't really mention now specifically. And as a result, we ended up having no merchant marine to speak of, except for the brief moment we had UPL, which was actually quite successful during the 50s to the 60s. This is United Philippines Lines, which was actually supported by the National Development Company, which is an investment arm of the government. But even from UPL, the biggest stakeholder there, which was Magsaysay Shipping, pulled out as early as the 1960s because it seemed that the government was not really capable of managing international shipping. So up to now, Magsaysay Shipping, which actually has a massive fleet, is still one of the biggest shipping liner companies in the whole world, while the Philippines has no national merchant marine to speak of. Yes, we do have a shipbuilding industry at the moment, but this is largely in partnership with foreign firms, especially from Australia. So I agree that the government, there's really much more help that the government can do in supporting Philippine shipping. But for now, they could show that support by at least improving the infrastructure and improving the institutional oversight, the management of the industry.
Thank you for that answer, Sir Carl. We have clearly, and this on my personal question na lang po. We have clearly seen po that the interplay or the role of the Spaniards po in the nation building aspect of our country. So this question po will be directed to Sir Nestor, but can be also expanded to by Sir Carl. But so the question po is, Sir Dr. Nestor, you said earlier that the Spaniards have detached our connections with the sea in the sense that they move our center of civilization from the sea towards to the more land features or ang Kapatagan, to the city centers of the Plaza Mayor and others. So as we now move to a more international outlook on trade, how do you think can the changes in the ongoing international trade affect the changes, how it affects our new culture po? So we are now seeing from though kahit na city center po tayo, we are now trading on a global scale. So how does it affect po yung current arrangement po natin? Do you still consider po our country to be more city-centered po and still do not have any connection to the sea, considering po that we now have this cultural or international expansion in terms of trade? So that's the question po. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. Before answering that, maybe just to continue with the previous question that Professor Poblador answered. So the question was on impact on coastal communities because Professor Poblador's answer was more on the transport industry. So for Philippine coastal communities, of course, I don't have data with me now, but based on my fieldwork experience, communities of small fishermen are among the poorest communities in the Philippines. So they're largely neglected, even by our own government. So they have to compete with big fishermen, big trawlers, mainly supported by foreign investment. So you will see many of our fish we import, but actually they were fished here in the Philippines. They were caught here in the Philippines. So what I'm saying now to go to the second question, I just stated as fact the shift from coastal communities and more into inland areas. But I was not arguing that we should go back to the sea. So what I'm trying to say is that we should have a balanced outlook. We should give importance to both, to inland areas and to coastal communities. Uh, Give value to our own production as well as in dealing with other countries abroad. We don't live in isolation anymore. So I'm not arguing that yes, we should develop our industry. We should but neglect others. So what you said is indeed true, that we are already part of the global market, and we cannot go back to the past, and we could not romanticize the past. But we should have a balanced uh, valuation of various Philippine communities, various industries, not neglecting one or the other. So that's my point of view.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much po. So now I would now like to call on Sir Lucio Pito po to give us and explain to us the contemporary maritime issues po. Sir, thank you po.
Yeah. Good morning again. Thank you, Darrell, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share my insights this morning. I benefited a lot from the wealth of insights from the earlier speakers, Dr. Castro and Professor Poblador, and I wish to also share my views from an international affairs um, standpoint. So let me share my screen again, please. Okay, so this morning I'll try to talk about the Philippines as a maritime nation, looking at the opportunities and the challenges more from a contemporary standpoint. Okay, so the outline of my presentation is I'll start with I think a lot of these points have already been covered by the previous two speakers, so I'll just breeze through them. So the sea is of course a blessing and a curse for the country, and so I'll try to outline the gains we got from the bounty of the sea, as well as the challenges and the risks and the threats associated with it. And then I'll talk about the revival of the significance of the sea um, as far as connectivity is concerned. And this is a uh, growing importance in recent years, not only from the Philippines, but also for other countries in light of increased trade and linkages between more and more countries. And then third, touch on efforts being made by government in recent years to try to protect the sea, and then close by um, outlining some of the approaches undertaken to try to address, manage, or handle the existing disputes, notably in the West Philippine Sea. So, the previous two distinguished speakers already highlighted the importance of the sea. Early on, going back to the period of our ancestors, as far as food and livelihood is concerned, and trade as well, people-to-people linkages, travel. In modern times, of course, the sea has also been lined up with submarine cables to improve internet, telecom services, and also increasingly a source of offshore energy. Now, on the risks and the threat side, um, overfishing, or as well as the illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is a growing concern, not only for Philippine waters, but also globally. Marine pollution and litter, this is also a problem. Philippines being listed as one of the major contributors to this tragedy. Oil spill, we had experiences with this, like the one in Guimaras previous years. Climate change, um, rising sea level, and its impact on fishing communities, the changing the salinity, the temperature, all of this will have effect on people and industries that are dependent on the sea. And of course, maritime disputes, which we'll talk about a bit later. And then also the maritime domain emerging as a theater for great power competition of late. Now, this is the a depiction of the waters where the Philippines can be found. The red lines correspond to shipping lanes, whereas the green lines represent the air routes. So both the seascape, the surface of the sea, and the airspace above the sea are important passageways for air travel as well as for commercial navigation. And this has been going on in the past, and this continues to go. In fact, there's more connections by sea and by air facilitated through these passageways. And we talk about the submarine cables. So it connects Americas to Asia, and this series of cables, we can find a lot of this works on the north of Luzon and on the south of Taiwan. So we see that strait, that Luzon Strait, very important for submarine cable and for telecoms. And also for offshore energy, many of the country's offshore energy resources, oil and gas, are located on the West Philippine Sea, west of Palawan, and a few in the Sulu Sea and in the Visayas Sea. So the sea is an important source of energy for the country. Of course, we have issues on the West Philippine Sea that, in a way, constrains our ability to harness resources in that area, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Um, Also, wind farm. There are proposals for the country to, there are existing windmills already, like in Ilocos and in Rizal, but there are plans to expand production of wind energy and to try to connect it with the grid to make sure that energy from this resource can be used more thoroughly. And the revival of the sea significance for as far as connectivity is concerned. The attention on the sea is growing, not only for countries, coastal states like the Philippines, but also for major powers. Again, for 250 years in the past, the Philippines has been the entrepot, the center for trade that links Asia, the Americas, and Europe. So the Manila Acapulco galleon trade that has been mentioned by previous speakers, um, with Manila allowing the entry of Chinese goods, including porcelain ware, and spices, and goods from Southeast Asia, going into the New World to Mexico, and from there to Sevilla in Spain. So this is one of the earliest major, trans international trade, where the Philippines played a very important role. And it is no coincidence that the first and the oldest Chinatown in the world is in Manila, Binondo, which today remains a very important hub for commerce. Um, Fast forward to the present times, China becoming the world's second largest economy, and by all indications, keen to become the world's biggest economy in the coming years, had embarked on the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a massive multi-year project to connect with neighboring countries and as far afield as Africa. And one component of that is the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which was announced in Jakarta in 2013 during a visit by President Xi Jinping. So this goes to show the importance being attached by our big northern neighbor and an emerging powerhouse economy to the sea. And other countries have also stepped in. Japan also launched its own concept of an Indo-Pacific back in 2013 also. So they're looking increasingly at the importance of the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, these critical waterways as crucial for Japan's trade and energy supply. US also came up with the free and open Indo-Pacific back in 2017. Although it's stronger on the security side, but we see also the importance they attach to freedom of navigation in overflight. For ASEAN, the ASEAN also came up with its own vision of the Indo-Pacific in 2019, but on the ground, we see a growing realization now to improve inter-island connectivity through RoRo, or the roll-on, the roll-off ferry. And this would boost connectivity in the insular or the maritime part of Southeast Asia, which includes the Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. That's BIMP IAGA, East Asia Growth Area. So BIMP IAGA is a sub-regional organization launched in Davao in '94 under the Ramos administration. This is a very important organization because it wants to promote trade, connectivity, and linkages between the four countries that are part of this. And it's also part and parcel of the larger Master Plan for ASEAN Connectivity 2025. And a portion of the ASEAN RoRo connectivity for BIMP IAGA had already been launched back in 2017. The Davao General Santos in Mindanao, connecting with Bitung in Sulawesi, has already been rolled out. But there had been concerns about the sustainability of the trade because the infrastructure and the market has still to be improved. So it was stopped in 2017. It was resumed in 2019. And then recently, it was again, there were proposals to expand the trade to cover larger areas to improve the viability of the trade route. And so beyond Davao, Jensen, Bitung, other routes are also being explored, one of which is Muara in Brunei Darussalam, connecting with the city of Zamboanga, also in Mindanao. There were also proposals to connect Palawan. The municipality of Batarasa just completed a new port called Buliluyan, to connect with the Kudat in Sabah. Uh, of course, beyond the concern about the viability of the trade, security has also been raised, and the Palawan Sabah route is still, I think, pending because of concerns about the security side. So this brings us to efforts being made by government to try to protect the seas. So there have been some, uh, of course, the capability development, the modernization of our frontline maritime agencies, notably the Coast Guard, the Philippine Navy, and the Air Force, is very crucial for in the country's shift from internal security, from counterinsurgency going into territorial and maritime defense. Of course, with these new assets and increased number of personnel, we are able to field in more maritime patrols and air patrols in areas that we consider as ours, including those being contested by our neighbors in the West Philippine Sea. We have also upgraded our facilities in the rocks and the features that we claim as part of our territory in the West Philippine Sea, notably Pagasa. It's our largest feature in that area. We had put up a new harbor, a marine science station, as well as a Coast Guard station. Now, there were plans. I think work is already underway to improve the airstrip there, the Rancudo airfield. And there were also this year, there were proposals to make Pagasa Island the logistics hub to provide supplies to other part of the Kalayaan Island group. Of course, a recent incident involving Ayungin raised the importance of having a more proximate source of supplies. Instead of supplies being sourced from Puerto Princesa and Palawan, if Pagasa can be made to accommodate larger supplies, store larger supplies, then it's better. It's easier. It's closer to other stations that we have, outposts in that area. Also, the country has also been investing in in sustaining and deepening its partnerships with allies and partners in the areas of joint training and exercises and support for maritime capacity building. So the U.S. has a maritime security initiative whereby it provides assets, including decommissioned assets, to littoral states like Philippines and Vietnam. Japan in recent years had also provided loans to build Coast Guard ships for the country. And so these kinds of mechanisms allow the country to improve its ability to guard and protect its seas. And in relation to the security issues in our deep south, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia in 2017 agreed to to do joint air and maritime patrols in the adjoining Sulawesi Seas, and this contributed in reducing the incidence of maritime piracy as well as armed robbery and sea kidnapping, which has been a source of embarrassment for the Philippines and a source of concern for our closer neighbors, Indonesia and Malaysia. So these are just some of the assets, platforms that the Philippine Navy, Philippine Coast Guard, Philippine Air Force had acquired in recent years from 2016 onwards. So we see that we have commissioned new assets. Of course, the crown jewel are the two new multi-role modern frigates from Korea built by Hyundai Heavy Industries. And the Philippines had also set its sights in acquiring submarines. Of course, the pandemic affected that plan, and there's a possibility that it may be put in abeyance, may be postponed until such time that our economy recovered to allow us to purchase such expensive item. So now I would go to some of the peaceful approaches being pursued by the Philippines in relation to a maritime role with neighbors. So the Philippines and Indonesia Maritime Boundary Delimitation Agreement stands out. It's the first of its kind that the Philippines entered into. This allows the Philippines to delimit its southern waters with that of Indonesia. And this MBD took 20 painstaking years of negotiations to bore fruit. This only goes to show how difficult, trying to address, boundary, sovereignty and sovereign waters. And so it was signed in 2014, but only entered into force in 2019. We have opened similar negotiations with other countries, also in relation to maritime boundary delimitation, including again with Indonesia and also with Palau, because we have a tri-junction boundary, and also with Japan. This month, we have also revived a past joint marine scientific research expedition with Vietnam. We have undertaken this joint marine science effort with Hanoi back in '96. So it ran from '96 to 2007. And then in 2007, China joined. So it became a tripartite arrangement. But unfortunately, because of the leadership change in the Philippines, among other factors, this was discontinued. So it's a welcome relief that this kind of effort to promote marine scientific research cooperation among coastal states on the south, bordering the South China Sea is being revived at this time. In 2018, the Philippines and China, when President Xi Jinping visited Manila, both countries signed an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding, to promote oil and gas cooperation, again in the West Philippine Sea. This is not unprecedented. We had entered into a similar arrangement back in 2004 under the Arroyo administration, where it started as a bilateral also between Philippines and China. And then the next year, in 2005, Vietnam also joined. So it became, again, a tripartite arrangement to undertake seismic work in the West Philippine Sea. In the 2005 JMSU, the Joint Marine Seismic Research, did not was discontinued also. Again, the leadership transition from the Arroyo to the Aquino administration. And of course, there were perceptions about concern about China, which we can touch a bit also later, maybe in the open forum if there's time. Um, and then finally, there's also the Philippines-Taiwan arrangement on concerning maritime law enforcement on in the waters north of Luzon, in the islands of the waters around Batanes and Babuyan Islands. So the Taiwan and the Philippines have overlapping EEZs. So in 2012, there's been an incident where one elderly Taiwanese fisherman died when the boat where he is in was fired upon by personnel of the Philippine Coast Guard, and this caused a diplomatic row between Manila and Taipei. And a few years after that, both sides decided to talk about how to prevent, such incidents from taking place, and hence this arrangement. So some of the concluding thoughts, because time is running out. Again, the maritime domain, the seas, is very important for the country. It's a constant, so there's nothing we can do about it. We have to live with it. Our strategy can adjust, to meet the changing times. We cannot change our geography, but we can change. We can adjust how we look at it, how we appreciate it, and how we respond to the challenges that comes with it. So we should try to make the most of our seas, extract energy resources, fisheries resources, make it safe for navigation and so on. But we also have to be prepared to confront, the challenges, not least from the maritime disputes angle. Policy continuity has been a challenge. So we see there have been efforts in the past, noble efforts to try to address our issues with our coastal neighbors, but eventually in the leadership transition, they fell apart, and then we have to go back to square one again. And so this is a concern that we have to be watchful for. And as we all know, we have upcoming elections in May of next year, and there's a possibility that some of the policies adopted by the current or the previous administration may be discontinued or continued, by the next leadership. So we'll see. So on that note, I'll end, and I'll be happy to take part in the dialogue. Thank you.
Um, Thank you very much, Sir Lucio, for that very comprehensive and very uh, elaborate presentation regarding the maritime security issues and current maritime security trends of our country right now. So before we proceed with the question and answer, we'd just like to tell them po that we'd like to greet Dr. Ambet Ocampo and Miss Veronica Dado po, who is part of our participants for right now. So, okay po, for the question and answer, kindly post for your question. We'll accept po 2 questions as we wrap with the event right now. Okay po, so now there are no questions, so I'll ask na lang po muna. So some of the prepared questions that we have. So this question po is directed for you, Sir Lucio. What is your take po on the current proposal of the Chinese regarding to fast track with the COC or the Code of Conduct po for our country right now? Do you think this is part of a larger ploy po to deter or to some extent neutralize some actions of Southeast Asian countries, or is it really part or to really create a stable architecture, security architecture for our region? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Sorry, I was not able to put ASEAN China COC on the slide, but yeah, I think it's a confidence building measure. Of course, there's a recognition that disputes in the South China Sea has been there for a long time, and it's a multi-party dispute. It's not only between the Philippines and China, and in fact, even if we have the ruling in 2016, third parties may not actually be bounded by it. So there is still a need for us to engage all parties. So while we have issues with China bilaterally, and we have mechanisms put in place, like the bilateral consultative mechanism, which already met 6 times, So we have to also look at regional mechanisms, try to bring in China on the table and try to engage China and, try to persuade China to conform, by pressure or by moral suasion or by other means, to to impose costs, to ensure compliance, on a binding and an effective COC. So the goal of the CFC was actually to avoid, incidents, and if ever these incidents, pop up, what would be the recourse, how should state actors behave, and what kind of penalties, if ever, can be put to bear, to offending or to erring parties. So the goal of the COC was to exactly have a GMRC when you are out sea, when you are in the South China Sea, how your Coast Guard ships, your naval ships, how they would behave, how they would conduct themselves when they interface with fishing vessels or civilian vessels or their counterparts, Coast Guard ships also. So the aspiration is that this document will be complied by all member states of ASEAN, 10 of them, and China, and that this would contribute in trying to dial down tensions in this contested sea.
Thank you po for that question. So, is there any question po from our audience right now before we close po and reflect for the entire forum? So right now, there's none. So I think we'll just wrap it up. So right now po, as Sir Dr. Nestor already leave, he told me that he has an important meeting by 12 o'clock. So right now, it's only Sir Carl and Sir Lucio. So I'll just wrap na lang po some of the reflections that we have for this event po. So for Dr. Nestor, his primary key thesis for the presentation was that the seas does not serve as a barrier, rather it serves as a highway. So his presentation from an anthropological perspective presented that the Philippine maritime culture connected Filipinos. We might not have the centralized form of government that I think European nations or some large civilizations enjoyed during that period, but in our case, the thalassocracies feature of our country, of our barangay back then, presented the unique maritime identity of our civilization. So for the presentation naman po of Sir Carl, he presented po the development of Philippine maritime economy and the significance of transportation in our economy as a whole. So he presented the history of the shipping line and its larger dynamics in the overall political development of our country. So from the history of economic development from different presidents as we adopt from import substitution to an export-oriented one and vice versa. Right now, from the debt-driven economy of the Marcos regime, and right now to the service-oriented economy that we have, clearly the maritime sector have been a crucial component in our economy. So just to add on that, currently our country is the uh, fourth largest shipbuilding nation, and one-fourth of the global seafarers are Filipinos. So, and these seafarers are the biggest contributor in the remittance sector of our economy right now, which is basically the one driving our consumption economy. So without Filipino seafarers or sailors, the consumption economy that we have right now is basically impossible. So that's one area for that we should give credence that we might not really feel for the maritime sector right now, but on that aspect alone, still a testament that our maritime economy or our maritime feature really defines our country and our economy. So for the final presentation naman po of Sir Lucio, he presented po the significance of maritime security in our country right now and the initiative taken and cross-nation partnership to really promote the regional architecture, security architecture of our country. That peace and stability actually requires the support of all the nations in the world. I hope I'm right po with this conclusion. So as we wrap po our presentation, I'll present na po our closing. So on behalf of Ames Museo Maritimo, we would like to send our gratitude po to our speakers, to everyone who shared their time and insights and made this forum possible. Also, we would like to thank all the participants who joined us today. Without you, this event will not be possible. So this forum po enabled us to understand our maritime issues and history. We might have obtained insights po from different perspectives, from an anthropological perspective, from an economic historian viewpoint, and of course, maritime security insight. But clearly, what we intended for this forum is to obtain and extract the common denominator, and that is the maritime features and maritime realities of our country. And hopefully we have successfully weaved these three different domains to really present a cohesive narrative regarding the maritime issues and contemporary maritime issues and maritime concerns that we have right now. So from the pre-Hispanic period, the Spanish period, and up until now, the maritime issues that we have. I really hope that everyone appreciate our maritime features. So may this forum help us navigate po on our current issues and capitalize on the opportunities it offers. So I'll just quote an important quote po from Seneca. He said po that if one does not know which port is sailing, no wind is favorable. So may this forum po serve us and guide us regarding our future po. So that's all po. And also our forum po is will be uploaded in YouTube. Right now po we are live in Facebook. So if you want to trace back po and watch it later or because hindi niyo po siya nasimulan, you can watch it in our Facebook. So for those who have questions po, just please uh, email Museo Maritimo at teams@edu.ph and we'll just forward these questions po to our speakers because of time constraint. So that's all po. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.